Hey, Jay Carper here from American Torah, continuing where we left off in Matthew chapter 24, starting in verse 29. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heaven to the other. Just going to do those three verses this time. Three. There's a whole lot in there. There are so many references here that tie into other scripture verses. I don't want to make an hour-long video, so I'm not going to read all those other passages. I'm just going to stick to this one for the most part. I really think it's important, especially when you're reading eschatology, apocalyptic literature, end time stuff, to let Scripture define the terms. Rather than imagining what we think these terms should mean, how are they used in the Bible? Like the sun, the moon, the stars. How does Scripture use these things, especially where it pertains to end times? So let's just go through some of these pictures here. The sun and the moon are darkened. This same thing happens in Isaiah 13, Isaiah 24. I think there's a passage in Ezekiel. There's several other places where it talks about the sun and the moon and the stars all being darkened. The sun and the moon, what exactly they represent, it's hard to say. I mean, in the dream of Joseph, of course, they represent his parents. Jacob and Rachel. Probably not what they mean here, although that's a possibility, and I'll get to that here in a second. Frequently in Scripture, when the sun is darkened, it's talking about one of two things. If it's a natural sunset, the sun goes down, then God is about to reveal something to his prophets. For example, in Genesis, when the sun sets, God puts Abram into a deep sleep and then makes a covenant with him, the smoking pot going between the parts of the animals. Later in Genesis, right after sunset, Jacob falls asleep and God gives him a vision of angels going up and down and passes on that same covenant to him. Supernatural sun darkening, when the sun and the moon are darkened. That's a different kind of thing. Now, it also indicates that God is acting, but in this case, it's much more serious, or at least it's much more unpleasant. I mean, the covenant with Abraham, it's hard to get more serious than that. But when the sun and the moon are darkened, it means that God is about to pour out his wrath. He has covered the light from the earth. We can't see anymore. We can't see our own way. And instead, God is going to punish the nations. For example, this happens in, I think it's Isaiah 13. It's a prophecy against Babylon. He says the sun and the moon will be darkened, and the stars will be darkened. And he even uses the power of the heavens will be shaken, and the earth trembles. Although that one isn't in this particular passage; that's elsewhere. And that's right before he pours out his wrath on Babylon. And then in Isaiah 24. He uses almost the exact same words, the same ideas anyways, when he's pouring out his wrath on the nations. And that appears to be what's happening here. I'm certain that Isaiah 24 and Matthew 24 are both talking about the same events. And in Isaiah 24, God is judging the whole nations, and he says that the powers of the heavens will be judged. And I think that's what it means here with the powers of heaven being shaken. These are supernatural beings, the spirits or the fallen angels who are driving the nations to come against God's people. Stars, pretty much throughout all of Scripture, stars are about Israel. God promised Abraham that his descendants will be as numerous as the stars of the heavens. And that theme is repeated over and over and over through Scripture, especially in the Torah, but also throughout the prophets. In Revelation, there's the angels The angels of the 7 churches are referred to as stars. The woman with the crown of 12 stars, these are the 12 tribes of Israel. So it's pretty consistent that stars represent Israel. The few exceptions are talking about individual stars, or they add some kind of qualifier like morning stars, something like that. And those usually refer to angels. In this case, I'm pretty sure it's talking about Israel. It says the sun and moon will be darkened, so there's judgment coming, judgment on the earth, on all the nations. The stars will fall from the heavens. Now Isaiah says that God hides the stars, that he covers them up with smoke, or that he hides them from the earth. They don't give their light, which isn't the same as them falling. And I'm not sure that there's supposed to be a difference, or if it's just a difference in wording. But I don't know what it would signify if the stars are falling from the heavens. Now, I'm also not saying that this can't literally happen, that the sun might not be literally eclipsed and the moon literally be darkened. And we could have a massive meteor shower, asteroids falling all over the earth. Who knows? But I think the primary meaning here is not literal, but it's talking about God's judgment coming on the earth, and the stars are the children of Israel, the nation of Israel. In verse 30, there's the sign of the Son of Man appearing in heaven. And it says that the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And this is exactly what the angel in Acts 1:11 says, that just as the Son of Man left, you'll see him coming back in the clouds with power and glory. But what is this with the tribes of the earth will mourn? Now the words here seem to indicate that this is not talking about the nations of the world, but these are specifically talking about the tribes of the land of Israel, that they will mourn. And if you look at Zechariah 12:10, it says that they'll look on the one who they have pierced, and they'll mourn for him. If you think about when Joseph revealed himself to his brothers, he mourned, and then when he met his father, there was mourning, and it's a little unclear there who was mourning on whose neck. But probably it was going both ways. And I think what's really happening is when the Son of Man returns, those natural-born descendants of Jacob, the natural Israelites, will finally recognize him and mourn for all of the centuries that they ignored him, that they didn't believe. And they will recognize him for who he is. And finally, in verse 31, the loud trumpet call. God will send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they'll gather together his elect from the 4 corners of the winds and from one heaven to the other. Now this happens in Isaiah 11. It talks about the same thing. In Isaiah 11, it specifically says that there will be a great call, a shout going out to the nations, which is, a trumpet is often equated with shouting. And it's the same word in Hebrew, teruah, can mean trumpet or shouting. There will be this great shouting out to the nations to call his people back to the land. And in Isaiah, I'm pretty sure it says that they are actually going to be coming back. Actually, I remember it says that there will even be a highway from Assyria so that his people will be able to come back peacefully. And it does talk about God subduing the nations. This is when he will enforce peace on the world, and his people will live in peace. The cobra with the child, and the wolf with the lamb. This is when God's people will be able to live in their land in peace, finally, without threat from the nations. Now there's another interpretation of this. The preterist view says that all of this already happened in the first century. And the big problem with this is that they'd put the sign of the Son of Man. I had to check with a preterist friend of mine before I said this, just to make sure. The sign of the Son of Man appearing in heaven, this is actually a metaphor of the destruction of the temple or of Jerusalem, depending. Except that Yeshua is pretty clear about the chronology of things here. At the beginning of this speech, he's giving you kind of an info dump of how a broad picture of how the world will look at the end. But starting in verse 15, it's more chronological. He says, this is going to happen, and then this is going to happen, and then immediately after that, this happens. And it puts the sign of the Son of Man at the end of the tribulation, after the tribulation. The destruction of Jerusalem, and especially the destruction of the temple, happened in the middle of the tribulation of 70 AD. Many, many thousands of Jews died or were sold into slavery. Many thousands were crucified after the destruction of the temple, after the destruction of the city of Jerusalem. And in fact, the abomination of desolation that Yeshua says back in verse 15 starts all this tribulation process. That actually happens after the destruction of the temple and the city of Jerusalem. That's one of the last things that Titus did before he left. I don't think that timing works. Yeshua is pretty clear that there is a sequence of events here. And I think that the events of 70 AD were a fulfillment of prophecy. I described in a previous video how prophecy is cyclical. It happens over and over and over again. And sometimes the order of events can be a little scrambled. This is like waves on a pond. You throw a rock into the pond, there's a big splash and lots of ripples coming out from there. I think that the final fulfillment of this is still to come, and that's the big splash. In 70 AD was just one of those ripples, not the main event. So there's the abomination of desolation, then the Great Tribulation, then followed by false messiahs and prophets and the Son of Man returning, then the nations are subdued, and then Israel is regathered. And I believe that this is all echoed again in Revelation 11. In Revelation is another one where you got to watch out for chronology. Some parts are chronological and some parts are not. And I think that seventh trumpet in Revelation 11 really represents the end of the tribulation and the establishment of God's people. And if you keep reading, it goes on to talk about the dragon and the woman with the 12 stars. I don't think that's chronological after Revelation 11. I think that's backing up way back in history and then telling a whole big part of the story over again from a different perspective. That happens a lot in prophecy, where it even happens, when it's not prophecy. Genesis 1 and 11, they do the same thing. 1 and 2. Genesis 1 tells the story of creation from one perspective. Genesis 2 tells the same story again from a slightly different perspective, with different purposes, which is why they're told differently. And I think the book of Revelation is actually multiple books. You could think of it as multiple books, kind of appended to each other, telling the same thing from multiple points of view for multiple purposes. Some parts are chronological, some parts are not. And you just have to depend on the context to figure out which is which. So I know that this sounds kind of confusing, but just remember that Yeshua's discussion here up through verse 14 is more of an info dump about the general state of affairs in the end times. Starting in verse 15, it's more chronological. The abomination of desolation happens, then there's tribulation, false messiahs and prophets and wars, and then immediately after the tribulation, the sun and the moon go dark, the stars fall from heaven, and the powers of heaven will be shaken. And I believe that all of this is spiritual. These are not, I don't believe that this is literal. The sun and the moon might be darkened literally, but it's talking about something spiritual happening, and it's the onset of God's wrath on mankind. That's what the sun and the moon going dark is. When the stars go dark, that could be God closing the world's eyes to the truth. We're supposed to be the light to the world. Israel is supposed to be a light to the world, shedding God's light and teaching the world Torah. But if God covers over us, hides us from the world, they can't see that truth anymore. And I think that is God sealing the fate of the nations. That's what's happening when the stars are covered over, or when they fall from the sky, where people can't see them anymore. Maybe we've gone into hiding, maybe we're out in the wilderness, I don't really know. But after that, then there's the trumpet, the call to bring all of God's people back together. And I believe it means physically going back to the land. I could be wrong about that. It could be, calling us all back up into visibility as the Commonwealth of Israel to be part of the government of the world during the millennial era. There's so much I don't understand, so much I don't know yet. Trying to fit all of the apocalyptic literature together and understand what it all means. It's important that everything is understood in the context and with the intent of the original authors, the original speakers. And they all relate to each other. Matthew 24 is not an island. It's not an apocalyptic island where it's not connected to Daniel and Ezekiel and Isaiah and Revelation and all these other prophecies. They're all tied together. They all use the same symbolism. So you have to understand them all together. So to understand Matthew 24, you have to read Isaiah, Zechariah, Ezekiel, Daniel, Revelation, Thessalonians. And it's a complex picture. I doubt that I will totally understand it all until long after it's happened. I have a suspicion, though, that we're going to start seeing some of this here real soon. And next time, we'll start with verse 32, and we'll talk a little bit about that. This is Jake Harper from American Torah. Be blessed.